Call the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to rise following the contributions from the member for Ballarat and member for Lyne on the ANL legislation repeal bill of 2019. As the member for Ballarat made very clear in her remarks, Labor does not oppose this legislation, which she has clearly mapped out is really tidying up an historical error in terms of two pieces of legislation that are before us now. This bill will repeal the ANL Act and the ANL Guarantee Act of 1994 to really effectively remove the current restrictions that are in place on these protected names associated with what was the formerly government-owned shipping line of the Australian National Shipping Line. Of course, we all know that line was subsequently sailed, and in recent years it has become apparent that the continued existence of the ANL Act and the ANL Guarantee Act poses a statutory bar for the new owners who continuing to sue the ANL trademarks, IP and web addresses. So the repeal of these two pieces of legislation makes sense. It will provide the CMA, CGA, the new French owners, with the legal clarity and certainty that they're entitled to in order to conduct business. So there is no opposition from Labor's benches here with that regards. But what I do wish to speak to now, Deputy Speaker, is the amendment moved by Labor, our Shadow Minister and the member for Ballarat, that is really highlighting the extraordinarily shocking record that this government has in terms of Australian shipping industry. The deliberate and active undermining of this industry, their representative union and the workforce, is literally gobsmacking and completely ignores the critical need for a strong, vibrant shipping, Australian coastal shipping industry for this nation. And I'm going to come to some of those reasons now, but of course I come from Newcastle, and the Port of Newcastle is a really key part of our region. And indeed, the people of Newcastle have a very, very proud maritime history. The Port of Newcastle has been in operation for I think now since the 19th century at least. It was around 220-odd years ago, I think, that that port was first started to be used. And the first exports of coal, of course, came from Newcastle, and that it remains the main staple of the Port of Newcastle. But it has been a critical link in our national supply chain for a very long time, as I said, centuries. That port in Newcastle is managing movements of more than 4,600 ships a year, and regretfully, the suite of policies that we have seen from this government, and indeed consecutive Conservative governments, has done nothing but undermine the viability of our shipping sector. And it's not just the laws around the manufacturing of it, making our shipping industry less and less viable. It's the treatment of the workforce that is particularly astonishing and particularly worrying. And just as the member for Lyons spoke about some of his constituents who were woken in the night to find out that they had no job, I too had men from Newcastle who were on the high seas, on their way to China, in fact, in the China Sea, aboard the MV Maralua, when they received an email to their ships in the dead of the night saying that the BHP had cancelled the ship's contract, and the entire crew had lost their jobs. This was just last February, Deputy Speaker. This is not old news, and it absolutely came out of the blue for those men on the ships. I remember speaking with David Grant, who was the seafarer from Tyes Hill, a community in my electorate of Newcastle. He said that the email was completely unexpected, and it certainly didn't help that it was they were literally in the middle of the China Sea with terrible internet connections. So it was very hard for them to get any real information. It was very difficult for them to speak with their families at a time when they needed to reach out and try and reassure each other. Even worse, Deputy Speaker, is that those men had taken a 2-year wage freeze because the company said that they couldn't afford to pay them anymore. They took a 2-year pay freeze in order to keep the company going and those ships running, and that's the recompense they were given. That's how they were repaid. They were sacked in the middle of the night via an email, and these are men who had been working at sea for, in Dave's case, it was 7 years he'd worked at sea. He wanted to continue doing so. Many of these men have generations of, they're working in an industry where their fathers and their uncles and their grandparents also work. They're very, very proud maritime workers. They're very highly skilled maritime workers, have finessed their craft, are amongst the best in the world. And that is the result of the terrific training that has previously taken place in Australia. And indeed, the strength of the MUA and the collective movement for maritime workers. I know many in the government benches are terrified of the MUA. They speak often about the CFMEU and MUA merger now and what that means for Australia. But I think what often gets lost in all of that is an understanding that, that is an organisation that is there to protect and represent the interests of those working men and women. And they have done a great job in doing so. And indeed, you need a strong collective labour movement to combat shocking exploitation like the sacking of those men in the dead of night and out in the middle of the China Sea without any warning, because it's not just that they were sacked. They knew that they were going to be replaced by a foreign crew that would be paid as little as $2 an hour. And it is the policies of this government that are completely implicated in those kinds of actions, because it is this government has continued to issue temporary licences for routes like the one that was being travelled by MV Maralua and indeed MV Lowland Brilliance and others that were clearly engaged in permanent work, have been doing so for year after year after year, but this government allows those temporary licences to be issued for those routes, and in doing so enables that kind of treatment of working men and women, where they can be sacked on the spot and replaced by foreign workers who are often in very vulnerable positions and are at the mercy of exploitative practices from a range of foreign-flagged vessels. And again, the work of the MUA in Newcastle in particular, who I want to give a very special shout-out to, their work combined with that of the International Transport Federation has been extraordinary in trying to call to account those foreign-flagged shipping companies that are not treating their workers properly. I was very fortunate as a candidate back in 2013 to work alongside of the ITF when they boarded foreign-flagged ships in Newcastle and did their inspections. And I can tell you that there were ships where their crew had not been paid for 3 months. It was unclear that they had enough rations in their cool room to get to the next port safely. Without the intervention of an international labour movement, without the spotlight from the media being shone on those examples, I feared gravely for what would happen to those men aboard that ship. They had no communications with their families, they hadn't been paid, and their food and water supplies were unlikely to last them to their next destination. I praise the MUA and the ITF for calling out those kind of dodgy, shonky operators in the industry. That's the job of a labour movement. That is the noble cause of a labour movement, and it is so often overlooked by members opposite who just have a very blinkered view about trade unions in Australia. I want to put on record those examples now as to say why it is that you need organised labour in this country. I'd also like to just point out that it's not just the propensity to issue temporary licences for routes that are clearly permanent ones that are travelled by those vessels. There are a whole suite of other policies that are at play by Conservative governments, both federally and state, that are playing into the decimation of an Australian shipping industry. And I would just like to highlight that the fact that the New South Wales Liberal government, the Berejiklian Liberal government, have not seen fit to overturn what is very clearly one of the dodgiest secret deals ever done by a state government when they're selling off our precious ports. They actually have a caveat at Newcastle now that when they privatised the Newcastle port, they did this little secret deal that protected Kembla and Botany from having effective competition on having a container terminal to inflate prices for the other two ports, so they got a good price in the New South Wales government coffers, but totally at the expense of Newcastle. So we now have an agreement where the government's imposed a cap on the number of containers that can leave the Port of Newcastle before incredibly onerous penalties would be applied. This is blatantly anti-competitive. Indeed, it is the subject. Thankfully, the ACCC has taken this up as an issue, and it is the subject before the federal court now. And I sincerely hope that the court finds, as indeed the evidence before me would suggest, that this is the most dodgy of deals ever stitched up in secret behind closed doors by a state Liberal government that we have ever seen. That agreement needs to be torn up, and Newcastle and the state government, New South Wales state government, needs to take their foot off the neck of our economy in Newcastle so that we can have a port that is able to diversify its economic base there. It's critically important. We want a port that, they also took their $12.7 million off the table for a passenger container terminal. We would have liked to have cruise ships calling into the Port of Newcastle. The people of Newcastle were very excited about having a passenger cruise ship terminal there. We're making some inroads in there. I see they want to build one down in a part of Sydney where the locals actually don't want one. Well, you might want to think about relocating that money and your energies instead of trying to force people of Sydney to take a passenger cruise terminal that they don't want up to Newcastle. You might want to put that $12.7 million and a bit more on the table so that such a terminal could be built in Newcastle. We want jobs. We want Australian ships. We want Australian flag ships back traversing our nation's waters, our coastline. We want Australian men and women to have good, secure, well-paid jobs on those ships. My colleagues have articulated before, it makes good economic sense. It makes good sense from the point of view of our national security, indeed. It is absurd that the world's largest island state would have less than 11 national ships anymore that we could call as part of our national fleet. Labor had a terrific plan to rebuild a national strategic fleet for Australia. The government could do well to adopt our plan.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Makin.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.